Dove Audio presents
The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. It was the evening on which Monsieur Debienne and Monsieur Poligny, the managers of the Paris Opera, were giving a last gala performance to mark their retirement. Suddenly, the dressing room of La Sorelli, one of the principal dancers, was invaded by half a dozen brats of the corps de ballet. They rushed in amid great confusion, some giving vent to forced and unnatural laughter, others to cries of terror. Sorelli, who wished to be alone for a moment, looked around angrily at the mad and tumultuous crowd. It was little Jeanne, the girl with the tip-tilted nose and the forget-me-not eyes, who gave the explanation in a trembling voice, "It's the ghost." Then she locked the door. Sorelli was very superstitious. She shuddered when she heard little Jeanne speak of the ghost, called her a silly little fool, and then, as she was the first to believe in ghosts in general and the opera ghost in particular, at once asked for details. "Have you seen him?" "As plainly as I see you now," said little Jeanne, whose legs were giving way beneath her, and she dropped with a moan into a chair. The room rang with a chorus of ballet girls, all talking together. The ghost had appeared to them in the shape of a gentleman in dress clothes, who had suddenly stood before them in the passage without their knowing where he came from. He seemed to have come straight through the wall. All the girls pretended to have met this supernatural being more or less often, and the ghost legend soon swelled to enormous proportions. They do meet so many men in dress clothes at the opera who are not ghosts, but this dress suit had a peculiarity of its own. It covered a skeleton. And, of course, it had a death's head. They reminded themselves of Joseph Buquet, the chief scene shifter at the opera, who had really seen the ghost and had said, "He is extraordinarily thin, and his dress coat hangs on a skeletal frame. His eyes are so deep you just see two big black holes, and his skin is a nasty yellow colour and is stretched across his bones like a drumhead. But it's the absence of his nose that is the horrible thing to look at, and the only hair he has is 3 or 4 long dark locks on his forehead and behind his ears." Now, Monsieur Buquet was a serious, sober, steady man, very slow at imagining things. His words had been received with interest and amazement by his fellow opera workers, and the story had spread fast. An agonizing silence now reigned in Sorelli's dressing room. At last, little Jeanne, flinging herself upon the farthest corner of the wall, with every mark of real terror on her face, whispered, "Listen!" Everybody seemed to hear a rustling outside the door. It was like light silk sliding over the panel. Then it stopped. Sorelli tried to show more pluck than the others, and went up to the door and in a quavering voice asked, "Who's there?" Nobody answered. Then Sorelli, armed with a dagger that never left her, turned the key, drew back the door, and looked into the passage bravely. It was empty. The dancer slammed the door, and with a deep sigh said, "No, there is no one there." "Still, we saw him," Jeanne declared. "He must be somewhere prowling about. We'd better all go down to the foyer together. I shan't go alone." The child reverently touched the little coral finger ring which she wore as a charm against bad luck, while Sorelli, stealthily, with the tip of her pink right thumbnail, made a St. Andrew's cross on the wooden ring which adorned the 4th finger of her left hand. "Come, children, pull yourselves together," said Sorelli. "I dare say no one has ever seen the ghost." "Yes, we saw him," cried the girls. "He had his death's head and dress coat, just as when he appeared to Joseph Buquet." A silence followed. It was broken by the little dried plum of Meg Giry, who said, "Joseph Buquet would do better to hold his tongue. My mother says the ghost doesn't like being talked about." "Why does your mother say so?" they all asked at once. Because... Nothing. I swore not to tell." This reticence exasperated the curiosity of the young ladies, who crowded round little Giry, begging her to explain herself and promising to keep the secret until Meg, burning to say all she knew, began, "Well, it's because of the private box. Box 5 on the grand tier. Mother has charge of it. No one has had it for over a month except the ghost, and orders have been given at the box office that it must never be sold. Mother has never seen him, but she has heard him. She knows because she gives him his program. Sorelli interfered. "Giry, child, you're getting at us." Thereupon little Giry began to cry. "I ought to have held my tongue, if Mother ever came to know. But I was quite right. Joseph Bouquet had no business to talk of things that didn't concern him. It'll bring him bad luck." There was a sound of hurried and heavy footsteps in the passage, and a respectable lady, built on the lines of a Pomeranian grenadier, burst into the dressing room and dropped groaning into a vacant armchair. Her eyes rolled madly in her brick-dust-coloured face, and she emptied a glass of liqueur that happened to be standing on a table. "How awful!" she said. "How awful! Joseph Bouquet is dead. He was found hanging in the third-floor cellar." "It's the ghost!" little Giry blurted. But she at once corrected herself with her hands pressed to her mouth. No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that." All around her, her panic-stricken companions repeated under their breaths, "Yes, it must be the ghost." No one ever knew how Joseph Bouquet met his death. The verdict at the inquest was natural suicide. A short time later, Sorelli ran into the Comte de Chagny on the first landing as he was coming up the stairs. "I was just going to you," he said. "Oh, Sorelli, what an evening! And Christine Daae, what a triumph!" The Comte de Chagny was right. No gala performance ever equaled this one. All the great composers of the day had conducted their own works in turns, but the real triumph was reserved for Christine Daae. Those who heard her say that her voice was seraphic, but this was nothing to the superhuman notes that she gave forth in the prison scene and in the final trio in Faust as Margarita. She had sung in place of the diva, La Carlotta, who was ill. No one had ever heard or seen anything like it. The whole house went mad, rising to its feet, shouting, cheering, clapping, while Christine sobbed and fainted in the arms of her fellow singers and had to be carried to her dressing room. A few subscribers protested. Why had so great a treasure been kept from them all that time? Did they know of her hidden genius? Why had she kept it hidden? The whole thing was a mystery. The Comte de Chagny, standing up in his box, listened to all this frenzy and took part in it by applauding loudly. Philippe Georges Marie, Comte de Chagny, was just 41 years of age. He was a great aristocrat and a good-looking man. He was exquisitely polite to the women and a little haughty to the men who did not always forgive him for his successes in society. He had an excellent heart and an irreproachable conscience. Philippe busied himself actively with his younger brother, Raoul, who was 20 years younger. In fact, he spoiled him terribly. He took him with him wherever he went. That evening, he had taken him to the foyer of the ballet. Raoul had a shyness and innocence that was remarkable. He had retained, from his purely feminine education, manners that were almost candid and stamped with a charm that nothing had yet been able to sully. He also had beautiful blue eyes and a small, fair moustache. After the staggering performance and their applause for Christine Daae, Philippe turned to Raoul and saw that he was quite pale. "Don't you see," said Raoul, "that the woman's fainting?" "You look like fainting yourself," said the Count. "What's the matter?" But Raoul had recovered himself and was standing up. "Let's go and see," he said. "She never sang like that before." They were soon at the door leading from the house to the stage, Raoul leading the way, feeling that his heart no longer belonged to him, his face set with passion. They entered into the semi-darkness of a corridor ringing with the name of Daae, Daae. The Count was surprised to find that Raoul knew the way. He had never taken him to Christine's himself. He followed his brother down the passage that led to Daae's dressing room and saw that it had never been so crammed as on that evening. The girl had not yet recovered from her fainting fit, and the doctor of the theatre had just arrived at the moment Raoul entered at his heels. Christine, therefore, received the first aid of the one, while opening her eyes in the arms of the other. "Don't you think, Doctor, that those gentlemen had better clear the room?" asked Raoul coolly. "There's no breathing here." You're quite right," said the doctor, who sent everyone away except Raoul. He imagined that the young man was only acting as he did because he had the right to. Meanwhile, Christine uttered a deep sigh, turned her head, saw Raoul, and started. "Monsieur," she said in a voice not much above a whisper, "who are you?" "Mademoiselle, he replied, pressing a fervent kiss on the diva's hand. "I am the little boy who went into the sea to rescue your scarf." Christine looked at the doctor and began to laugh. "Mademoiselle," Raoul said, "I should like to say something to you in private, something very important. When I am better, do you mind?" She rose and passed her hand over her eyelids. I should like to be alone. Please go away, all of you. Leave me. I feel very restless this evening." Raoul was soon left alone outside her room. He felt a terrible pain at his heart. Suddenly, the dressing-room door opened and the maid came out. He asked how her mistress was. She said that she was quite well, but that she wished to be left alone. One idea filled Raoul's burning brain. Of course! Christine wished to be left alone for him. Hardly breathing, he went up to the dressing-room and prepared to knock, but his hand dropped. He heard a man's voice saying, "Christine, you must love me." Christine's voice, infinitely sad and trembling, replied, "How can you talk like that when I sing only for you?" Raoul's heart, which had seemed gone forever, returned to his breast and was throbbing loudly. He held it in his two hands to make it stop. The man's voice spoke again. "Are you very tired?" "Oh, tonight I gave you my soul, and I am dead," replied Christine. Raoul heard nothing after that. He had learned what love meant, and at the same time, hatred. The door suddenly opened, and Christine appeared alone. She closed the door behind her, but did not lock it. Raoul knew that he loved. He also wanted to know whom he hated, and when the passage was clear, he opened the door of the dressing-room. He went in and shut the door behind him. "There is someone here," said Raoul in a quivering voice. "What are you hiding for?" All was darkness and silence. Raoul heard only the sound of his own breathing. He quite failed to see that the indiscretion of his conduct was exceeding all bounds. He struck a match. There was no one in the room. "Am I going mad?" he thought aloud. He stood for 10 minutes in the silence of the empty room, but lover though he was, he did not even think of stealing a ribbon that would have given him the perfume of the woman he loved. During this time, the farewell ceremony on the occasion of the retirement of Monsieur Debienne and Monsieur Poligny, the opera's managers, was taking place in the foyer of the ballet. Everybody remarked that the retiring managers looked cheerful, as is the Paris way. None will ever be a true Parisian who has not learned to wear a mask of gaiety over his sorrows and one of sadness, boredom, or indifference over his inward joy. Sorelli, the prima ballerina, had begun to recite her farewell speech when an exclamation from that little madcap of a Jeanne broke the moment. "The opera ghost!" she yelled, and her finger pointed to a face so pallid, so ugly, with two deep black cavities under the straddling eyebrows. But in the ensuing confusion, he had already slipped through the crowd. Sorelli was furious. She had not been able to finish her speech. The managers had kissed her, thanked her, and had gone to the great lobby outside where a supper was being served in their honor. Here they found the new managers, Monsieur Armand Moncharmin and Monsieur Firmin Richard. The retiring managers handed over to their successors the two tiny master keys which opened all the doors, thousands of doors, of the opera house. Their attention was diverted, however, by the discovery at the end of the table of that strange, wan, and fantastic face with the hollow eyes that had moments before appeared in the foyer. The friends of the retiring managers all thought this lean and skinny guest was an acquaintance of their successors, while the new manager's friends believed the cadaverous individual belonged to the old manager's party. The result was that no request was made for an explanation, no unpleasant remarks, and no jokes in bad taste were made which might have offended this visitor from the tomb. Suddenly, he began to speak. "The death of that poor Bouquet is perhaps not so natural as people think. He was found this evening, hanging in the third cellar." The ex-managers at once rose and stared strangely at the speaker. They looked at each other and turned whiter than the tablecloth. They made a sign to Monsieur Richard and Monsieur Moncharmin and muttered a few words of excuse to the guests, and all four went into the manager's office. First, Monsieur Poligny and Monsieur Debienne asked them if they knew that man sitting at the end of the table. When they answered in the negative, the retiring managers advised them to have new locks made with the greatest of secrecy for all the rooms and closets. Messieurs Richard and Moncharmin thought this so funny that they began to laugh and to ask if there were thieves at the opera. Monsieur Poligny replied that there was something worse. There was the ghost. He went on to tell them that he would never have spoken to them of the ghost if he had not received formal orders from the ghost himself to ask them to be pleasant to him and to grant any request he might make. The announcement of the death of Joseph Bouquet had served them as a brutal reminder that whenever they had disregarded the ghost's wishes, some fantastic or disastrous event had brought them to a sense of their dependence. Monsieur Richard, however, had acquired a great reputation for practical joking, and he seemed to relish the dish which was being served up to him in his turn. He and Monsieur Moncharmin could not, at the finish, help bursting out laughing at the faces of Monsieur Poligny and Debienne, who, seeing them pass straight from a serious and supposedly sincere state of mind to one of insolent merriment, acted as though they thought the new managers had already gone mad. Monsieur Poligny went to his desk and returned with a memorandum book. It contained a paragraph at the end written in red ink in a queer, laboured handwriting. It said, "The manager shall make to the opera ghost an allowance of 20,000 francs a month, say 240,000 francs a year." "Oh, is this all? Does he not want anything else?" asked Monsieur Richard with great coolness. "Yes, he does," replied Monsieur Poligny, and read, "Box 5 on the grand tier shall be placed at the disposal of the opera ghost for every performance." Monsieur Poligny proceeded, without moving a muscle in his face. "Certainly consider what the loss over Box 5 meant to us. We really can't work to keep ghosts. That is why we prefer to go away." Thereupon the ex-managers left the office, and Messieurs Richard and Moncharmin had a great laugh. The first few days which the new partners spent at the opera were given over to the delight of finding themselves at the head of so magnificent an enterprise. They had forgotten all about that curious, fantastic story of the ghost, when an incident occurred that proved to them that the joke, if joke it were, was not over. Monsieur Richard received a letter marked private. He at once recognized the red ink and the clumsy, childish hand. He opened it and read, "Dear Mr. Manager, I am sorry to trouble you at a time when you must be so very busy, renewing important engagements, signing fresh ones, and generally displaying your excellent taste. I should like to take advantage of the fact that you have not yet turned Christine Daae out of doors by hearing her this evening in the part of Cybele, and I will ask you not to dispose of my box today, nor on the following days. I thought that your predecessors, who were always charming to me, had neglected before leaving to mention my little fads to you. I have now received a reply from those gentlemen proving that you know all about my memorandum book and, consequently, that you are treating me with outrageous contempt. If you wish to live in peace, you must not begin by taking away my private box. Your most humble and obedient servant, Opera Ghost." "They're keeping up the joke," said Monsieur Richard, "but I don't call it funny." "What does it all mean?" asked Monsieur Moncharmin. "Do they imagine that because they have been managers of the opera, we are going to let them have a box for an indefinite period? What is it they really want? A box for tonight? They might have been civil for all that. By the way, they seem to be greatly interested in that little Christine Daae." The whole rest of the day was spent in discussing, negotiating, signing, or cancelling contracts. The next morning, the managers received a card of thanks from the ghost. It read, "Dear Mr. Manager, thanks. Charming evening. Daae exquisite. Choruses want waking up. Will write soon for the 240,000 francs. Kind regards, O.G." On the other hand, there was a letter from Messieurs Poligny and Debienne. Gentlemen, we are much obliged for your kind thought of us. However, we have no right to occupy Box 5 on the Grand Tier, which is the exclusive property of him of whom we spoke to you when we went through the memorandum book with you the last time. See Clause 98, final paragraph. Oh, those fellows are beginning to annoy me, shouted Monsieur Richard, snatching up the letter. That evening, Box 5 was sold. The next morning, Monsieur Richard and Monsieur Moncharmin, on reaching their office, found an inspector's report relating to an incident that had happened the night before in Box 5. Apparently, the occupants created a regular scandal by their laughter and their ridiculous observations. The people did not seem to be in their right mind, and they made stupid remarks, laughing and saying that they would not leave unless they had their money back. The inspector finally had them turned out indefinitely. "Send for the inspector," Monsieur Richard said to his secretary, who called for him at once. "Tell us what happened," said Monsieur Richard bluntly. "What were those people laughing at?" The inspector replied, "They must have been dining, sir, and seemed more inclined to lark about than to listen to good music. The moment they entered the box, they came out again and called the box-keeper, who asked them what they wanted. They said, 'Look in the box. There's no one there, is there?' 'Well, no,' said the woman. 'Well,' said they, 'when we went in, we heard a voice saying that the box was taken.'" Monsieur Moncharmin could not help smiling as he looked at Monsieur Richard, but Monsieur Richard did not smile. He himself had done too much in that way in his time not to recognize all the marks of one of those practical jokes which begin by amusing and end by enraging the victims. "Send for the box-keeper," he shouted, "this minute." She soon made her appearance. "What's your name?" he demanded. "Oh, Madame Giry. You know me well enough, sir. I'm the mother of little Giry, little Meg." "Never heard of her," the manager declared, "but that's no reason, Madame Giry, why I shouldn't ask you what happened last night." "Well, I'll tell you what happened," she said. "The ghost was annoyed again." It appeared that Madame Giry thought it quite natural that a voice should be heard to say that the box was taken when there was nobody in the box. Nobody could see the ghost in his box, but everybody could hear him. "You've spoken to the ghost, my good lady?" "Well, as I'm speaking to you now, my good sir," Madame Giry replied. "Well, when the ghost speaks to you, what does he say?" "Well, he tells me to bring him a footstool." This time Monsieur Richard burst out laughing, as did Monsieur Moncharmin and the secretary. "Instead of laughing," she cried indignantly, "you'd do better to do as Monsieur Poligny did, who found out for himself." "Tut," said Monsieur Moncharmin. "A ghost asking for a footstool? Then this ghost of yours is a woman?" "No, the ghost is a man." "How do you know?" "Well, he has a man's voice. Oh, such a lovely man's voice." "Well, and what did you do?" demanded Monsieur Richard. She replied, "Well, I brought him a footstool." The inspector, who was standing behind the box-keeper, was waving his arms to attract the attention of the managers. He tapped his forehead with a distressful forefinger to convey his opinion that the widow Giry was most certainly mad. Meanwhile, the worthy lady went on about her ghost. "At the end of the performance, he always gives me 2 francs, or sometimes 5, sometimes even 10. Some evenings I find flowers in the box, a rose that must have dropped from his lady's bodice, for he brings a lady with him sometimes. One day he left me a box of English sweets, which I'm very fond of. "Thank you, Madame Giry, that'll do. You can go." Madame Giry had bowed herself out, and the manager told the inspector that they had decided to dispense with that old mad woman's services. Then they told each other of the idea which they both had in mind, which was that they should look into that little matter of Box 5 themselves. Christine Daae did not immediately continue her triumph at the opera. She acted as though she were no longer the mistress of her own destiny, and as though she feared a fresh triumph. Raoul de Chagny tried in vain to meet her, but she showed herself nowhere. Then one morning she sent him the following note. "Monsieur, I have not forgotten the little boy who went into the sea to rescue my scarf. I am going to Perros in the fulfillment of a sacred duty. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the death of my poor father. He is buried there with his violin in the graveyard of the little church where we used to play as children. Raoul hurriedly consulted a railway guide, dressed as quickly as he could, and jumped into a cab which brought him to the Gare Montparnasse just in time to catch the morning train to Perros. As he sat in his compartment on the Brittany Express, he read Christine's note over and over again, smelling its perfume, recalling the sweet pictures of his childhood. The nearer he drew to her, the more fondly he remembered the story of the little Swedish singer. Daya's father was a great musician, perhaps without knowing it. Not a fiddler throughout the length and breadth of Scandinavia played as he did. His wife died when Christine was only 6, and he then cared only for his daughter and his music. He sold his patch of ground to search for fame and fortune as a rustic fiddler who tramped the roads with his pretty child who sang like an angel from heaven. One day, on the seashore of a village in a faraway corner of Brittany, a little boy, who was out with his governess, made her take a longer walk than she intended, for he could not tear himself away from the little girl whose pure, sweet voice seemed to bind him to her. There was a high wind that day, which suddenly blew Christine's scarf out to sea. She gave a cry and put out her arms, but the scarf was already far on the waves. Then she heard a voice say, "It's all right. I'll go and fetch your scarf out of the sea." She saw a little boy running fast in spite of the cries of his governess. He brought back her scarf. Boy and scarf were soaked through. Christine laughed merrily and kissed the little boy, who was none other than the Vicomte Raoul de Chagny. For the rest of the season, they saw each other and played together almost every day. They both had the same calm and dreamy cast of mind. They delighted in stories and old Breton legends. One of their favorite stories was about the angel of music, who played a part in all Daddy Daye's tales. Daddy Daye maintained that every great musician received a visit from the angel at least once in his life. Sometimes the angel leans over their cradle. Sometimes the angel comes much later, because the children are naughty, and sometimes he does not come at all, because the children have a bad heart or a bad conscience. No one ever sees the angel, but he is heard by those who are meant to hear him. Persons who are visited by the angel quiver with a thrill unknown to the rest of mankind. They cannot touch an instrument or open their mouths to sing without producing sounds that put all other human sounds to shame. Daddy Daye's eyes lit up when he said, "You will hear him one day, my child. When I am in heaven, I will send him to you." 3 years later, Raoul and Christine met again. Christine flushed at the sight of Raoul, who went up to her and kissed her. She ran into the garden and took refuge on a bench, a prey to feelings that stirred her young heart for the first time. Raoul followed her, and they talked till evening, very shyly. When they took leave of each other, Raoul said, "Mademoiselle, I shall never forget you." He went away regretting his words, for he knew that Christine could not be the wife of the Vicomte de Chagny. As for Christine, she tried not to think of him and devoted herself wholly to her art. Those who heard her prophesied that she would be the greatest singer in the world. One day, however, her father died, and suddenly she seemed to have lost, with him, her voice, her soul, and her genius. Then came her lightning flash in the gala performance of the opera, when an angel's voice was heard on earth for the delight of mankind and the utter capture of Raoul's heart. Why did she not recognize me that night, thought Raoul, and why had she written to me? He reached Perros at last and walked into the smoky sitting room of the Setting Sun Inn, where he saw Christine standing before him smiling and showing no astonishment. "So you have come," she said. Raoul, taking her little hand in his, said, "I love you, Christine. I cannot live without you." She replied gravely, "I did not make you come to tell me such things as that." There was something in Christine's attitude that seemed to Raoul not natural. However, he did not feel any hostility in her, far from it. The distressed affection shining in her eyes told him that. "When you saw me in your dressing room, was that the first time you noticed me, Christine?" "No," she said. "I thought so," said Raoul. "But then why, when you saw me in your room at your feet, did you answer as though you did not know me?" "You won't answer? Well, I'll answer for you. It was because there was someone in the room who was in your way, the man to whom you said, 'I sing only for you.'" Christine seized Raoul's arm and clutched it with a strength which no one would have suspected in so frail a creature. She carried her hand to her heart, a prey to indescribable emotion. "Listen, Raoul," she said. "I have decided to tell you something serious, very serious. Do you remember the legend of the Angel of Music?" "I do indeed," he said. "Well, Raoul, my father is in heaven, and I have been visited by the Angel of Music. Yes, it's true, in my dressing room. That is where he comes to give me my lessons daily, and I have not been the only one to hear him." "Who else heard him, Christine?" "You, my friend. The other evening, it was he who was talking when you were listening behind the door. It was he who said, 'You must love me.' I then thought that I was the only one to hear his voice. If you had opened the door, you would have seen that there was nobody in the room." "That's true," he said. "I did open the door when you were gone, and I found no one in the room. So you see." "Well?" "Well, Christine, I think that somebody is making a game of you." She gave a cry and ran away, calling out, "Leave me! Leave me!" Raoul went to his room feeling very weary, very low-spirited, and very sad. He tried to sleep. It was about 11:30 when he heard Christine's door turn slowly on its hinges. Where could she be going at this hour? Softly opening his bedroom door, Raoul saw Christine's white form in the moonlight slipping along the passage. Raoul followed behind her, taking no pains to deaden the sound of his footsteps, anxious, in fact, that she should turn round and see him. But she seemed not to hear him, and acted exactly as though he were not there. She quietly left the inn and walked quickly up the road. She began almost to run until she came to the church. She knelt down by her father's grave, made the sign of the cross, and began to pray. The clock struck midnight, and at the last stroke, Christine lifted her eyes to the sky and stretched out her arms as though in ecstasy. Raoul was wondering what the reason could be when he raised his own head and seemed drawn himself towards the invisible, which was playing the most perfect music. He remembered all Christine had told him of the Angel of Music. He then seemed to hear noises from some skulls in a heap of bones nearby. It was as though they were chuckling at him. He could not help shuddering, but it occurred to him that the musician he was hearing might be hiding behind that very heap of bones. Then a skull rolled to his feet. Then another, then another. It was as if he were the mark of a ghastly game of bowls. He had an idea that a false step must have destroyed the balance of the structure behind which the musician was concealed, because he saw a shadow suddenly glide along the sacristy wall. He ran after it and caught hold of a corner of its cloak. The shadow turned round. Raoul saw a terrible death's head, which darted a look at him from a pair of scorching eyes. He felt as if he were face to face with Satan. That was all he could remember the next morning, when they found him half frozen, more dead than alive, on the steps to the altar of the church. After Monsieur Richard and Monsieur Moncharmin decided to look into that little matter of Box 5, they made their way through the front rows of stalls to the box on the grand tier. They were almost alone in the huge, gloomy house, and a great silence surrounded them. A few rays of light, a wan, sinister light that seemed to have been stolen from an expiring luminary, fell through some opening or other upon an old tower that raised its pasteboard battlements on the stage. Everything in this deceptive light adopted a fantastic shape. They made for the left boxes, and from there stared silently at Box 5 on the grand tier. In the semi-darkness of the theatre and the partial gloom that filled Box 5, Monsieur Moncharmin and Monsieur Richard saw a shape in the box. They said nothing, but spontaneously seized each other's hand. They stood like that for some minutes without moving, with their eyes fixed on the same point, but the figure had disappeared. Then they went out and, in the lobby, communicated their impressions to each other and talked about the shape. One had seen a thing like a death's head resting on the ledge of the box, whereas the other saw the shape of an old woman who looked like Madame Giry. They decided that they really had been the victims of an illusion, whereupon, without further delay and laughing like madmen, they ran back to Box 5 on the grand tier, went inside, and found no shape of any kind. "Those people are making fools of us," Monsieur Richard exclaimed, and ended by saying, "It will be Faust on Saturday. Let us both see the performance from Box 5 on the Grand Tier." On Saturday morning, the joint managers found a letter from O.G. "My dear managers, so it is to be war between us. If you still care for peace, here is my ultimatum. It consists of the 4 following conditions. 1. You must give me back my private box. 2. The part of Margarita shall be sung this evening by Christine Daae. Never mind about Carlotta, she will be ill. 3. I absolutely insist upon the good and loyal services of Madame Giry, my boxkeeper, whom you will reinstate in her functions forthwith. 4. Let me know by a letter handed to Madame Giry, who will see that it reaches me that you accept, as your predecessors did, the conditions relating to my monthly allowance. If you refuse these conditions, you will give Faust tonight in a house with a curse upon it. Take my advice and be warned in time. O.G. Look here, I'm getting sick of him, shouted Richard, bringing his fist down on his office table. At that moment, the door opened. Madame Giry entered and said hurriedly, "Excuse me, gentlemen, but I had this letter this morning from the opera ghost. He told me to come to you." She did not complete the sentence. She saw Firmin Richard's face, and it was ready to burst. He could not speak, but suddenly he acted. First, his left arm seized Madame Giry and made her describe so unexpected a semicircle that she uttered a despairing cry. Next, his right foot imprinted its sole on the black taffeta of a skirt which certainly had never before undergone a similar outrage in a similar place. The opera rang with her indignant yells. About the same time, the diva, Carlotta, rang for her maid, who brought her letters to her bed. Among them was an anonymous missive written in red ink in a hesitating, clumsy hand, which ran, "If you appear tonight, you must be prepared for a great misfortune at the moment when you open your mouth to sing. A misfortune worse than death." The letter took away Carlotta's appetite for breakfast, and she pushed away her chocolate. It was not the first letter of the kind which she had received, and she added to herself that she was not the woman to be intimidated. When she had finished thinking over the threat contained in the strange letter, she got up. The first thing she saw when looking out of her window was a hearse. She was very superstitious, and the hearse, coupled with the letter, convinced her that she was running the most serious dangers that evening. Monsieur Richard's private secretary called to ask after the diva's health, and returned with the assurance that she was perfectly well, and that, were she dying, she would sing the part of Margarita that evening. It was 5 o'clock when the post brought Carlotta a second anonymous letter in the same hand as the first. It was short and said simply, "You have a bad cold. If you are wise, you will see that it is madness to try to sing tonight." Carlotta sneered, shrugged her handsome shoulders, and sang 2 or 3 notes to reassure herself. At the opera that night, the only unusual thing seemed to be the presence of Monsieur Richard and Monsieur Moncharmin in Box 5. The opera began, and the famous baritone, Carolus Fontha, had hardly finished Dr. Faust's first appeal to the powers of darkness when Monsieur Richard, who was sitting in the ghost's own chair, leaned over to his partner and asked him chaffingly, "Well, has the ghost whispered in your ear yet?" "Wait, don't be in such a hurry," replied Monsieur Moncharmin in the same gay tone. "The performance has only begun, and you know that the ghost does not usually come until the middle of the first act." Monsieur Richard smiled and pointed to a fat, rather vulgar woman dressed in black, sitting in a stall in the middle of the auditorium with a man in a broadcloth frock coat on either side of her. "Who on earth are those?" asked Monsieur Moncharmin. "Those, my dear fellow, are my concierge, her husband, and her brother," replied Monsieur Richard. He explained that he had persuaded his concierge, in whom he had the greatest confidence, to come and take Madame Giry's place. The first act rang with gay song, but nothing unusual happened. Soon Carlotta crossed the stage and sang the only 2 lines allotted to her in the second act, and was received with enthusiastic applause, and this act also passed without incident. The managers left the box during the interval, and when they returned to their seats, the first thing they saw on entering the box was a box of English sweets on the little shelf of the ledge. Who had put it there? They asked the box keepers, but none of them knew. Then they went back to the shelf and, next to the box of sweets, found an opera glass. They looked at each other. They had no inclination to laugh, and then they seemed to feel a curious sort of draught around them. They sat down in silence. The next act began with Christine Daae singing with a bunch of roses and lilacs in her hand. Christine, raising her head, saw Raoul de Chagny in his box, and from that moment her voice seemed less sure, less crystal clear than usual. "What a queer girl she is," said one of Carlotta's friends. "The other day she was divine, and tonight she's simply bleating." Raoul put his head under his hands and wept. Behind the curtain of his hands that veiled his boyish tears, he thought only of a letter which he received. It said, "My dear little playfellow, you must have the courage not to see me again, not to speak of me again, my dear Raoul. My life depends on it. Your life depends upon it. Your little Christine." Raoul's brother, the Count, sat behind him and viciously gnawed his moustache, shrugged his shoulders and frowned. For him, usually so cold and correct, to betray his inner feelings like that by outward signs, the Count must be very angry. He was. He had seen his brother return from a rapid and mysterious journey in an alarming state of health. The explanation that followed was unsatisfactory, and the Count asked Christine Daae for an appointment. She had the audacity to reply that she could not see either him or his brother. There were thunders of applause when Carlotta made her entrance in the third act. She flung herself into her part without restraint of modesty. Then suddenly, a terrible thing happened. Faust had knelt on one knee to sing of his love to Margarita, and as Carlotta replied with her song, the terrible thing happened. Carlotta croaked like a toad. "Cawack!" There was consternation on Carlotta's face, and consternation on the faces of all the audience. Everyone felt that the thing was not natural, that there was witchcraft behind it. Poor, wretched, despairing, crushed Carlotta. She spent some seconds asking herself if she had really heard that note, that sound, that infernal noise issue from her throat. Meanwhile, in box 5, Monsieur Moncharmin and Monsieur Richard had turned very pale. Monsieur Moncharmin's hair stood on end. Monsieur Richard wiped the perspiration from his forehead. The ghost was there, around them, behind them, beside them. They felt his presence without seeing him. They heard his breath close, close, close to them. They were sure that there were 3 people in the box. What was going to happen? This happened. "Cawack!" They felt that they were smarting under the ghost's attacks. They were waiting for the catastrophe. The ghost had told them it would come. Carlotta's voice alone once more filled the resounding house. "I feel without alarm. Cawack! Cawack!" The 2 managers collapsed in their chairs. The ghost was chuckling behind their backs, the mouthless voice saying, "She is singing tonight to bring the chandelier down." With one accord, they raised their eyes to the ceiling and uttered a terrible cry. The immense mass of the chandelier was slipping down, coming toward them. It plunged from the ceiling and came smashing into the middle of the stalls amid 1,000 shouts of terror. It crashed down upon the head of the wretched woman whom Monsieur Richard had appointed to succeed Madame Giry, the ghost's boxkeeper. She died on the spot. That tragic evening was bad for everybody. Carlotta fell ill. As for Christine Daae, she disappeared after the performance. Raoul, of course, was the first to be astonished at the prima donna's absence. He wrote to her at Madame Valerius's apartment where she lived, but received no reply. He resolved, come what might, to inquire in person at the apartment. He trembled as he rang the bell, and was ushered into an ill-lit room where he at once recognized the good, kind face of Christine's benefactress, Madame Valerius. "Monsieur de Chagny," she cried gaily, putting out both her hands to her visitor. "Ah, it's heaven that sends you here. We can talk of her." "Madame, where is Christine?" he asked at once. The old lady replied calmly, "She is with her good genius." "What good genius?" exclaimed poor Raoul. "Why, the angel of music. Why don't you come near me as you used to when you were a little boy? I'm very fond of you, Monsieur Raoul, you know, and so is Christine, too." He asked in a low voice, "What makes you think that Christine is fond of me, madame?" Well, she used to speak of you every day. Really? What did she tell you? Well, she told me that you had made her a proposal. The good old lady began laughing wholeheartedly. Raoul sprang from his chair, flushing to the temples, suffering agonies. If you're angry with me for laughing, I beg your pardon. Did you think that Christine was free? Is Christine engaged to be married? The wretched Raoul said in a choking voice. Why, no, why, no. The angel of music forbids her to marry. He tells her that if she got married, she would never hear him again. Madam, will you have the goodness to tell me where that genius lives? She raised her eyes and said, In heaven. He now realized the possible state of mind of a girl brought up between a superstitious fiddler and a visionary old lady, and he shuddered when he thought of the consequences of it all. He hurriedly took leave of Madame Valerius. He walked home to his brother's house in a pitiful state. The angel of music. He knew him now. It was, beyond doubt, some unspeakable tenor, a good-looking jackanapes who mouthed and simpered as he sang. And she, what a bold and damnable sly creature. His brother, the Count, consoled him and suggested taking him out to dinner. Raoul dressed in frantic haste, prepared to forget his distress by flinging himself, as people say, into the vortex of pleasure. Alas, he was a sorry guest. And leaving his brother early, he found himself by 10 o'clock in the evening in a cab. The road seemed deserted and very bright under the moonlight. Then suddenly, a carriage turned the corner of the road and came quietly in his direction at walking pace. As it approached, he saw that a woman was leaning her head from the window. "Christine!" he called out again. "Christine!" No reply. She had passed without answering his cry. Nothing was colder than his heart. Nothing half so dead. He had loved an angel, and now he despised a woman. He was thinking of dying, and he was only 20 years old. His valet found him in the morning sitting on his bed. He had not undressed, and the servant feared at the sight of his face that some disaster had occurred. Raoul snatched his letters from the man's hands. He had recognized Christine's paper and handwriting. She wrote, "Dear, go to the masked ball at the opera on the night after tomorrow. At 12 o'clock, be in the little room behind the chimney place of the big crush room. Wear a white domino and be carefully masked. As you love me, do not let yourself be recognized. Christine." Raoul read it over again with fevered eyes. The somber picture, which he had for a moment imagined of a Christine forgetting her duty to herself, made way for his original conception of an unfortunate, innocent child, the victim of imprudence and exaggerated sensibility. To what extent at this time was she really a victim? Whose prisoner was she? What monster had carried her off, and by what means? Raoul's fingers clutched at his flesh, above his jealous heart. In his inexperience, he now asked himself with terror what game the girl was playing. Up to what point could an opera singer make a fool of a good-natured young man, quite new to love? Oh, misery! Thus did Raoul's thoughts fly from one extreme to another. He no longer knew whether to pity Christine or to curse her. At all events, he bought a white domino. The hour of the appointment came at last. With his face in a mask, he certainly would never be recognized. At 5 minutes to 12, he entered the room mentioned in Christine's letter and waited. He did not wait long. A black domino passed and gave a quick squeeze to the tips of his fingers. He understood that it was she, and he followed her. They passed through the great crush room and noticed a group crowding round a person whose disguise, eccentric air, and gruesome appearance were causing a sensation. It was a man dressed all in scarlet, with a huge hat and feathers on top of a wonderful death's head. From his shoulders hung an immense red velvet cloak, which was embroidered in gold letters, "Don't touch me. I am Red Death stalking abroad." Raoul passed in front of the funereal masquerader, who had just happened to turn in his direction, and he nearly exclaimed out loud, "The death's head of Perros!" The black domino hurried her pace and Raoul's as though they were being pursued. They went up 2 floors. Here the black domino opened the door of a private box. She tried to close the door, but Raoul prevented her, for he had seen a red foot, followed by another, and slowly, majestically, the whole scarlet dress of Red Death met his eyes. Raoul exclaimed, "This time he shall not escape me." Whom do you mean by he? Christine asked. Who shall not escape you? Who? He repeated angrily. Why he, the man who hides behind that hideous mask of death, the evil genius of the churchyard of Peros, Red Death, in a word, madam, your friend, your angel of music. But I shall snatch off his mask, and I shall know whom you love and who loves you. Oh, in the name of our love, Raoul, you shall not. He stopped. What had she said? In the name of their love? Never before had she confessed that she loved him. Pooh, her only object was to gain a few seconds. She wished to give the Red Death time to escape. You lie, madam, he said, for you do not love me, and you have never loved me. What a poor fellow I must be to let you mock and flout me as you have done. I despise you. She allowed him to insult her. She thought of but one thing to keep him from leaving the box. Look here, he cried. Can't you tell me what all this means? What have you been doing this past fortnight? What is this tale about the angel of music? What is this farce? Christine simply took off her mask and said, Dear, it is a tragedy. Raoul now saw her face and could not restrain an exclamation of surprise and terror. The fresh complexion of former days was gone. A mortal pallor covered those features, which he had known so charming and so gentle, and sorrow had furrowed them with pitiless lines, and traced dark and unspeakably sad shadows under her eyes. My dearest, he moaned, holding out his arms, forgive me. Some day, perhaps, she said, resuming her mask. Then she went away, forbidding him with a gesture to follow her. He watched her till she was out of sight. Then he turned down the passage that led to her dressing room. He tapped at the door. There was no answer. He entered, and the room was empty. Suddenly he heard steps in the passage, and had only time enough to hide in the inner room. Christine entered. She sighed, and Raoul heard her murmur, Poor Eric. At first he thought he must be mistaken. If anyone was to be pitied, it was he, Raoul. Suddenly she seemed to be listening. Raoul also listened. A faint singing seemed to issue from the walls. He heard a voice, a very beautiful, very soft, very captivating male voice. The voice came nearer and nearer until it was in the room in front of Christine. Christine rose and addressed the voice. Here I am, Eric. I am ready. Raoul, peeping from behind the curtain, could not believe his eyes, which showed him nothing. The voice, without a body, went on singing. Raoul began to understand how Christine was able to appear one evening before the stupefied audience with accents of a beauty hitherto unknown, of a superhuman exaltation, while doubtless still under the influence of the mysterious and invisible master. The strains went through Raoul's heart, and he succeeded in drawing back the curtain that hid him, and he walked to where Christine stood. She began moving toward her image in the mirror. The two Christines, the real one and the reflection, ended by touching. Raoul followed and put out his arms to clasp the two in one embrace, but by a sort of dazzling miracle that sent him staggering, Raoul was suddenly flung back while an icy blast swept over his face. He rushed back up to the glass. Christine had disappeared. Raoul struck at the walls. The room still echoed with a distant, passionate singing. The tears were streaming down his young cheeks as he expressed aloud, Who is this Eric?